Mr. Speaker, the case against the Minister is clear.
You're about to see the government use a gag motion against the opposition.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I move that the member no longer be heard.
The Leader of the House has moved that the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary.
All the rules of how the House of Representatives runs is set out in what's called the standing orders. The gag motion is one of those rules, and it allows any member of Parliament to interrupt someone who is speaking and move a motion that the member speaking be no longer heard. A vote is then taken, and if successful, it means the member who is speaking can no longer continue. It effectively shuts them down. And the government uses this gag motion constantly.
Brittany Higgins also said.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, I think Leader of the Opposition's had a fair go. I move that he be no longer heard.
Is the motion seconded? The member for Isaacs.
Seconded. This is a government of rotters who are trashing our democracy. It is a day of shame.
His seat. The Leader of the House has the call.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I move that the member be no longer heard.
Yesterday, the government abolished the key protection against bribery in this parliament. That's what the member's interest is there to do. And yesterday they decided it's just...
The Leader of the House has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move the member be no longer heard.
Is the motion seconded? The member for Isaacs.
Seconded. This government has opened the door to corruption
The
and opened the door to bribery.
The Leader of the House has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I move the member be no longer heard. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I move the member be no longer heard.
The Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the member be no longer heard.
Within a year and a half of Scott Morrison winning the 2019 election, there had been around 538 divisions or official votes. Only 18 of those, or 3%, were to pass legislation. But more than 200, or over 40%, were gag motions. To be fair, governments from both sides have used the gag motion historically, but its use in the last few years has skyrocketed to the point where it is constantly applied by the government to shut down debate. There's only one problem. This gag motion was never intended to be used in this way. So to take a look at how we got here, let's go back over 100 years to 1905, when this standing order was first introduced. Back then, things were very different. It was just a few years after Federation and the creation of the federal government itself. In Parliament, there were no time limits on how long a politician could speak, and this could be a problem. As one member put it, I felt very much bored last session by long speeches of 4 or 5 hours duration. To help solve this problem, Alfred Deakin, who at the time was Australia's second Prime Minister, introduced the gag motion in November 1905. He said this new rule would protect free speech by giving more members an opportunity to talk, something that couldn't happen if speeches were taking hours and hours. He also said that the new standing order need rarely, if ever, to be used for party purposes, and never will its application be dictated by partisan motives. It's interesting that over 100 years later, the rule he introduced was being used to restrict rather than protect free speech, and used solely for political reasons. But even in 1905, Alfred Deakin's proposed rule wasn't well received by the opposition parties. Two of their responses in the debate at the time stood out to me. One member, George Edwards, made a good point about the need for time limits. If it be desired to prevent speeches from being extended to inordinate length, we can impose a time limit. We should not allow a brutal majority to close the mouth of an opponent by moving that he be no longer heard. And in 1912, a few years after the gag motion was introduced, time limits were finally brought into the House of Representatives, now known as Standing Order 1. But the gag motion wasn't removed. It remained there to allow the government of the day to stop debate. Arthur Robinson, another member arguing against this new rule at the time, correctly predicted that the opposition would be the real loser. He said that it would be the easiest thing in the world to closure a member of the opposition, but it would be impossible to do the same to members of the government. And he was right. Technically, any member of the House can move a gag motion, but you need a majority to agree with you, otherwise it won't pass. And because the government holds the majority, it means that it can pass a gag motion at any time against anyone. What this means is that non-government members are the ones that lose out, while the government is practically immune to being gagged. Here's a typical example. In 2020, an independent on the crossbench, Andrew Wilkie, tried to raise an issue about live animal exports, but the government gagged him.
Deputy Speaker, there is an urgent need for the House to consider this motion.
The Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I move that the member no longer be heard.
The Greens tried to support the motion, but were also shut down.
Seconded. We must stop these ships of
The
shame.
Leader of the Greens will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
I move that the member no longer be heard.
The Leader of the House has moved. The Leader of the Greens be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye.
Regardless of the merits, the fact that members cannot raise issues and talk about them for the Parliament to consider is a problem. But you won't see the government face these kinds of restrictions when they're trying to raise issues. Interestingly though, I found that in December 2019, Labor became fed up with the constant gag motions and tried to turn the tables for a day or two to make a point. It didn't have much impact because ultimately they didn't have a majority. But it is amusing to see the reactions of government members who themselves vote in favour of gagging others, suddenly being subjected to it themselves.
I call the Honourable Member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and with a little trepidation.
Yes, I call the member for Shortland.
I move that the member be no longer heard.
I put the question, all of that opinion. Call the Honourable Member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It doesn't surprise me that Labor would try and shut down a debate on integrity. Integrity to them, it's like sunlight to a vampire. Run away, run away. This is not your topic.
I think he's so shocked that he's forgotten that he belongs to the Liberal Party.
Call the Honourable Member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Mr Deputy Speaker. I call the member for Shortland.
I move that the member be no longer heard.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And what a waste of taxpayers' money and time to conduct themselves in this way. Disgusting. Disgusting. Mr Deputy.
The member for Calais.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Deputy Speaker.
Yeah, you have a call.
I move that the member be no further heard. It's how he just voted. It's his choice. He opened it up.
I call the member for Mallee.
Deputy Speaker.
You have the call, yeah.
Given what just happened in the House of Representatives, I move that the member be no further heard.
Now, look, I might just add that this is going to make things very unorderly if we continue in this tit-for-tat manner. I call the member for Swan.
The member for Watson knows he's being ridiculous. Yes. Absolutely ridiculous.
Excuse me, the member for Swan. Leader
Given
of the
that
House.
the member only moments ago voted for a gag motion, I move that he be no further heard.
Okay. We'll put the question. Fine.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker.
I move that the member be heard.
Look, we've spoken about this before.
The member opposite voted in the House of Representatives to gag another member. Yeah. This is just returning the favour.
Okay. Well, now, members must be aware that I've spoken about this tit-for-tat serial moving of motions that members no longer be heard. I said it's disorderly. It remains disorderly under 187. I now suspend the business of the House and adjourn the Federation Chamber till 10 a.m. on Thursday, the 5th of December.
The fact that this gag motion has been used more and more by the government has become an issue. It's even harder to have a healthy discussion about ideas. When it's time for a vote, all the members walk in and vote in line with what their party dictates. There probably isn't too much consideration being given to the underlying issues or how their constituents feel about them. Now, I'm not saying that removing this gag motion will fix that, but it will help restore the free flow of debate within Parliament. We have time limits now. There is no reason this can't be revisited and updated. It's been well over 100 years. I think it's about time. Thanks for watching. If you want to help me make more content, please consider checking out my Patreon page, links in the description.